Conservatives complain a lot about people on the left having a victim mentality. Now, I'm a progressive, and I personally don't use that phrase for reasons that I'll explain. But we have all met that person who blames all their failures on other people and never takes any action to improve their life. And so I think that this victim mentality phrase points towards something real and important. It's just not the most helpful way of talking about it. So I want to suggest some alternative language here. The phrase that social scientists use to talk about this is locus of control. Locus meaning location or place. So the phrase locus of control means something like, where do you believe the center of control of your life is located? Where do you believe your life is controlled from? Your locus of control can be either internal, meaning that you believe that your life is controlled from within through your own choices, or it can be external, meaning that you believe your life is determined by forces outside of your control. You're just powerless, and your life just happens to you. So social scientists have found that an internal locus of control means that you will have much better life outcomes, including better grades, higher incomes, lower stress, longer marriages, more friends, and higher job satisfaction. So there's all kinds of really great outcomes that are associated with an internal locus of control. And an external locus of control causes higher levels of depression, of anxiety, and of criminality. So your beliefs about where your life is controlled from, about that locus of control, turn out to be super important. So conservatives are onto something in that respect. And a really important finding of all of this research is that your locus of control is learned. You can learn to have an internal locus of control, and of course, you also learn to have an external locus of control. You're not born one way or the other. You are trained into one of these perspectives or the other one. And that's crucial because it means that that troubled relative of yours who never takes any responsibility for their life, they could get better. They could learn how to have an internal locus of control. For instance, there was a study in 1998 that took a bunch of fifth graders and they had them do some puzzle problems. And then they praised all of them for their high scores. However, they divided them into two experimental groups and they praised the two groups differently. Half the students were told, you must have worked really hard at these problems. The other half of the students were told, you must be really smart. So their successful outcomes on these problems are being explained in two different ways. One in terms of effort, which is within your control. One in terms of intelligence, which is outside of your control. So there's an internal locus of control group and an external locus of control group. And then the students were given a second round of puzzles. And the students who had been complimented on their hard work worked longer on the second set, they scored better, and they reported having more fun. Whereas the students who had been complimented on their smarts did worse on the puzzles and didn't push themselves in the second round. So with just one little compliment, that one little change in how you compliment kids, a parent or teacher can dramatically change that kid's motivation level. Holy cow. I mean, we need to be teaching every kid internal locus of control. We need to be teaching every parent and every teacher how to give better compliments to their kids. This is a really, really big deal. And it's not just kids, it works with adults too. The author Charles Duhigg wrote this great book called Smarter, Faster, Better. And he tells this story about the Marine Corps. In 1985, a guy named Charles Krulak became the commandant of the Marine Corps. And he says that he immediately noticed a problem with the recruits that the Marine Corps was getting. A lot of them, he says, a lot of these kids didn't just need discipline, they needed a mental makeover. They'd never belonged to a sports team, they'd never had a real job, they'd never done anything. They didn't even have the vocabulary for ambition. They just followed instructions their whole life. And according to Krulak, that wasn't the kind of person the Corps needs. Marines are the first ones on site when there's something going on, so they have to make decisions under pressure. They need to be extreme self-starters. So he started consulting with psychologists about how to teach recruits to be more self-motivated. And in the process, he discovered this study that the Corps had done a number of years before, which showed that the best Marines were the ones with an internal locus of control. And so he said, okay, this is what we've got to target. We've got to figure out how to teach the recruits internal locus of control. And he started reforming basic training on that principle. So just as a few examples, now drill instructors constantly put recruits in situations where they have to make judgment calls. The goal is to get them addicted to the feeling of control that comes from taking initiative. In fact, they have one exercise where they put these gas masks on the recruits and they cannot hear anything through the gas mask. And they explicitly tell them you are not allowed to go until you hear a verbal order from your commander. Well, obviously, they can't hear a verbal order from their commander with that gas mask on, so they have to find some way to work through. And ultimately, the purpose of the exercise is to teach them that you can't always wait for an order. Sometimes you have to take a little bit of initiative and you have to think a little bit outside the box. Also, drill instructors now are only allowed to compliment things that are surprising. So they never tell a recruit, you are a natural born leader. They compliment the shy person for stepping up and leading even though it's hard. When the platoon goes for a run, they're not going to praise the former track star who got the best time. They're going to praise the overweight guy who improved so much on his time from yesterday. So they're really targeting effort and they're targeting things that go above and beyond for compliments. And the reforms to basic training that Krulak made have been a huge success. Recruits exhibited a measurable increase on measures of locus of control in kind of a debrief, a study that they did. And their recruits' retention rate and performance scores have increased by more than 20%. So really big gains in terms of the outcomes that they were trying to improve. And one of the people who benefited from this new basic training regime was Eric Quintanilla. And this is a story, again, that Charles Duhigg tells in his book. Quintanilla joined the Marines in 2010, and he had never felt in control of his life. He had always just taken whatever job he could get, worked in a hobby store, had no particular passion for hobbies, flunked out of a lot of job interviews because he had no passion for the work. And eventually he decided to join the Marine Corps because he'd gotten married, his wife was pregnant, and he knew he had to do something in order to create a better life for his family and earn more money. And so when he signed up, the recruiter shook his hand and said, "Thank you, you made the right choice." And he replied, "It's the only one I see for myself." So that just gives you a sense of where this guy was at before. And at the end of the training, Quintanilla said, "You think a boot camp is going to be all screaming and fighting, but it's not. It's not like that at all. It's more about learning how to make yourself do things that you thought you couldn't do. It's really emotional, actually." So here's the point of this whole story about the Marines. If you talk about success and failure in terms of your own choices and your own effort, you are going to have that internal locus of control. You are going to be way more motivated, you are going to be way more successful, and you are going to be way more happy than if you attribute your success or failure to your own inherent abilities that you were born with, or to your upbringing, something that your parents did, or to your circumstances, things that just happened to you, or whatever. It's just a scientific fact that an internal locus of control will make your life better in all sorts of ways. So bringing this discussion now back to the concept of victim mentality. If I say someone has a victim mentality, really what I'm saying is that they have an external locus of control with all of the behavioral problems and bad life outcomes that come with that. But of course, it's a very loaded phrase. And what I really mean when I say someone has a victim mentality is that person sucks. That's just not a great person. It's a very judgmental way to frame this concept of external locus of control, right? And if I want to persuade you, if you have this external locus of control and I want to persuade you to change your behavior, be a better person, and develop an internal locus of control, telling you that you have a victim mentality is probably the worst thing that I could say, because you're going to turn off and you're going to tune me out, because screw me, I don't know your struggle. So imagine if instead of saying you have a victim mentality, I instead say, what I hear you saying is that you feel like you don't have control of your life. You feel like your life is driven by things outside of your control. Did you know, though, that just believing that you have control gets you halfway there. There's all sorts of research that shows this, that if you can just embrace the belief that your choices will change things, that gets you halfway to where you want to be in life. Now, obviously, that simple message, saying that to somebody, is not going to change their life. Like, that's not going to solve all their problems. But at least you might be receptive to what I'm saying if I frame it that way, right? You might at least listen to what I have to say. You're not going to instantly close up your ears and cut all ties with me because I insulted you. So that to me is the first problem with that victim mentality phrase. It's going to turn people off rather than be persuasive. And I think that there are more persuasive ways to frame this. When you complain about people with a victim mentality, you're only preaching to the converted, people who already agree with you, people who already have an internal locus of control. It's like, that guy has a victim mentality. Yeah, we feel so much better about ourselves because we're not like that person who has a victim mentality, right? So it's all about sort of my ego. You're never going to actually persuade or convince someone who actually needs to hear this message about where their locus of control would more productively be located. The second problem with this victim mentality phrase is that there's a good chance that if someone has a victim mentality, they probably were actually victimized at some point. And if they had been victimized, then by accusing them of having a victim mentality, you are blaming the victim. You are being borderline cruel and gaslighting, right? So we've already talked about one way that people learn an external locus of control, which is that their parents or their teachers compliment them in the wrong way or explain their failures in the wrong way, right? If I tell you you're smart because you succeeded, therefore you must be smart, I am giving you an external locus of control. And likewise, if I tell you that you failed in school because you're too dumb, I am framing things in terms of an external locus of control, and you are going to stop trying at school because you're just going to be like, school's just not for me. I'm just not smart enough for school. And that in itself is a kind of victimization, right? Because you have been trained the wrong way. Your parents and your teachers have failed you. At minimum, you are a victim of bad training. But there's another way also that people learn to have an external locus of control, and this one is way more insidious. They go through a serious trauma that genuinely isn't their fault and that they genuinely have no control over, and all of their efforts to control it fail. And therefore, after a bunch of failures like that, they just conclude that this is the way the world is and they give up. Social scientists call this learned helplessness. And the concept stems from a classic experiment in 1965 by a guy named Martin Seligman. And in the first phase of this experiment, Seligman had dogs and he shocked them repeatedly with electricity, and nothing that they could do would change the shock. They'd get the shock regardless of what they did. And in the second phase, he put the dogs into a crate that had a low wall down the middle, and the floor on one side of the crate was electrified and the floor on the other was not. And he expected the dogs to, when they got shocked, to jump over the low wall, and then they would not get shocked on the other side, right? The shock should have driven them to take some kind of action in order to stop being shocked. But what he found was that instead of jumping over the low wall, the dogs just laid down and took it. Because they had learned in that first phase of the experiment that there was nothing that they could do to stop the shock. And so in the second phase, they had given up and they didn't even try. They had learned that they were helpless. And I mean, this is already a cruel experiment, right? I mean, this is classic 1960s science, shocking dogs repeatedly. But it would have been even more cruel if, when the dogs lay down, Seligman had kicked them and said, "Why do you have such a victim mentality, dog? You need to take responsibility for your life," right? The dog had good reasons for giving up because this guy had just shocked them to no end, and they had nothing that they could do would stop it. So they learned sort of the logical lesson from that, that they were helpless. And it's not going to suddenly motivate you because I criticize you harshly. Speaking harshly to someone who has gone through this is not going to change what they have learned. If anything, it's just going to sap their motivation even more. So you've got to find gentler ways to reawaken that person's sense of control. We humans are not dogs, but we are not wired so differently from dogs. And if it's cruel to kick a dog when a dog has learned that it is helpless and given up on life, it's even more cruel to kick a person when they have learned that same lesson through trauma, right? Um, and this really is the paradox of locus of control. It is 100% useful to have an internal locus of control because it means that you respond in an empowered way and you take control of your life. But it is not 100% realistic because sometimes things really are outside of your control. There are some things that you can't control, and sometimes you are helpless, and sometimes you do go through trauma, right? Sometimes you are a victim. Um, and so I think that there's like a happy medium here where you recognize that yes, some things are outside of your control, but still you know that you need to believe and act and talk as if they are within your control. And you apply sort of the internal locus of control lens. You look at your own life through internal locus of control glasses. You judge your own life as an outcome of your own choices. But when you're judging other people's lives, you show a little bit more compassion for the role that circumstances play. You still talk to them about the power of making choices and changing their life, but you have just a little bit of empathy for the circumstances that brought them to where they are, and maybe the bad training that they've gotten that leads them to have the mentality that they have. So, what might a compassionate approach to locus of control look like? Well, what if instead of imprisoning every criminal, we tried putting some of them in a rehabilitation program designed to increase their sense of control over their lives? What if we applied some of these same principles that the Marines are using in boot camp and that teachers and parents are using at home and in the school with their children, and we put the prisoners through the same kind of training, and we taught them how to take control, how to achieve a sense of control over their lives? What if instead of looking down on poor people as people who just have no motivation and are just failures at life, what if we gave them the same kind of coaching that rich people pay lots of money for? These CEOs all over the nation are paying for business coaches and they're paying for life coaches, and they're getting constant reinforcement both from peers and from these professionals to teach them these principles, to teach them this mentality of an internal locus of control. What if we offered that to people who were not as successful in life in order to lift them up and give them the same kind of support and the same kind of reinforcement? What if we trained parents and teachers all over the country to compliment children on their effort instead of their smarts? What if we had training programs for parents to instruct them on how to talk to their children in order to cultivate an internal locus of control? You would lose that sense of superiority that comes from judging people and saying, look at those people with the victim mentality. You would lose that. But maybe you'd also change the world. What if changing the world is within our control?